This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining my webinar on the topic of ROI of CX programs. Let's be clear, that's rather a big topic to handle in a relatively short webinar. So we're going to share the slides with you afterwards. And if you'd like to know more about the topic, do feel free to connect to me or ask me for a private webinar, which we gladly do. So, without further ado, just a quick one. I've been working in the customer experience and customer strategy field for over 15 years now. Had the privilege to work with a lot of big names. I'm sure you recognize some of those logos. And we're active in the whole field of CX, from design, operationalizing, engaging the people, and making sure that you actually earn money with it. So I think everybody who's here today knows that CX brings value. And we also know that the voice of the customer helps us to drive CX. So why are we still looking for ROI? We know that calculating the value of an unhappy customer is, or a happy customer is the basis for every ROI program that we have. Customers who are so happy that they would recommend you are more profitable. They spend more, they negotiate less, they stay longer as a customer, they're more open to upselling, they're easier to service. And that, by the way, is a very important point that's often overlooked, that a happy customer has a happy and much faster interaction with, for instance, a contact center agent than an angry one. And an angry customer, we've seen it at Mercedes, at their contact center. If we had 3 angry customers shouting at an agent in a row, the 4th customer, no matter how happy he came in, got a bad treatment from that agent. Not to mention that the agent himself also, if he gets shouted at all day long, at some point he will give up and seek a different job. And that's also not good if we have that kind of turnover in the contact center. So I think everybody agrees this, everybody knows more or less these parameters, but how do we take it from there? And I've given a lot of webinars in the last 2 years, and when we asked before to people, what are your pain points when we're talking about your CX program, we always came up against these same 5 topics: how to set up the program correctly, how to get buy-in, how to drive action, how to get ROI out of the program, and how to make sure that the program keeps running and is not just a one-off exercise. And interestingly enough, or maybe logically, all of these points are quite connected to each other. So we have developed a little framework that I think can guide your quest for ROI, but also your quest for a more sustainable and more bought-in program within your company. At the end of the day, it's about this little CCC framework. And of course, you know, we consultants, we love these little acronyms, particularly 3-letter acronyms. Let me go into that a little bit. At the core, and that's not what we're talking about today, is you need a platform, systems, metrics, processes, etc., that deliver actionable insights. That can be a great voice of the customer program. It can also be a customer journey management software. There's a lot of ways of getting actionable insights out of the core, the technical heart of your system. I'll gladly do another webinar on that. But when we have these actionable insights, we need to create value with those insights. We need to make sure that we close the loop, that we get back to every individual customer that we have information on, that has shared some feedback with us, or that we have observations on their current state of mind. We need to use those insights also to drive sales. And often overlooked in CX programs, there's also a lot of operational efficiencies to be found by being more customer-centric. For instance, the whole lean movement is based on stop doing what does not add value for the customer. Stop having systems and processes in place that are simply serving internal management purposes. So step 1 is we need to make sure that we create value. Let's look into that a little bit more. The biggest thing and what we keep hammering on in every single program is close the loop. Drive action by closing the loop. And just for those who are new to the term, closing the loop means very literally close the communication loop with the customer, act upon what he has told you, and let him know that you have acted upon it. On the other hand, there's the strategic closed loop, which is about organizational improvements. In other words, hey, we're seeing a lot of customers complaining about a particular topic. Let's identify the root cause, see if there's a strategic reason, make sure that we involve all the functions and departments that are relevant, and change something. And yet again, communicate this back to the customer and communicate it back within the company. We'll get back on the topic of communication a little bit later. So at the tactical level, learn what does and does not work, identify the behavior changes that are needed. For instance, if we see that very simply, we had the example of a store manager where we got a lot of feedback that this particular store manager was more focused on their managerial tasks than on actually engaging the customer. There we have a very clear improvement point, which we can then engage the store manager on. So this underlying philosophy is the key to driving action. And just as an example, why driving action is so extremely important, this is from a B2B customer of ours, where we did an initial NPS survey. And it seems like there's a great progression, the more margin their customers generate, and you see this is a very big company, very big customers. And in the group, the segment that creates more than 1 million in margin each, they have an NPS of 40%. That sounds great until you realize that it means, in this case, that there are 6, 7, or 8 individual companies with more than 1 million margin, not just turnover, margin, who are extremely unhappy and are about to leave. And that means you need to drive action. And this is an underlying problem with a lot of CX programs, that there's too much focus on KPIs, on numbers, on measurements, while the true value often lies, or pretty much always lies, in identifying the individual customer that is very happy and that you can do something with, and I have a great example coming for that, or with the individual customer who is unhappy that you need to act upon to prevent them from leaving. So this is about creating the ROI. And one of my favorite examples in ROI creation is from Weber, the barbecues, where we did a first setup. Later we did many other ways, but just from the very first trial, voice of the customer, we got great feedback. A lot of people said something along the lines, would I recommend you? Oh, I love you. I have already recommended you, and I've forced my neighbor and my brother and my nephew to also buy a Weber barbecue. And why? Because the meat tastes so much better. Now, between you and me, I don't know whether Weber meat tastes so much better than Barbecook or George Foreman or whatever other grill you want to use. But that's irrelevant, because this is what the people tell us why they love the brand and why they recommend the brand. So let's turn that into profitable action. They used to have, not actually Gordon Ramsay, but pretty much the equivalent of Gordon in Germany as their spokesperson, and did the typical 30-second TV commercials with him. However, what we see is people saying it's the experience that makes the difference. So they stopped the TV commercials and turned everything into experience. Make sure that you do as many demonstrations at the garden centers as possible, as many demonstrations at the barbecue centers, and that way drive new business. Also, we asked as a second question, what can we improve? The answer was by 40% price. However, by comparing who said that, it was the same people who in the first line said, "We love you and we have recommended you." In other words, they're so happy with the brand that they cannot think of anything else but price. No, cheaper is always better, particularly in Germany. So the outcome of this was that we could double sales in 3 years by focusing entirely on experience, and we could keep the margins. So if we had looked at it a different way, we might have gotten the impression that the price is a problem. Well, it actually was perfect. So this is a very nice case of how to use the outcomes of a good voice of the customer program and turn it into operational profit. Another example from a German B2B retailer, they're looking at the responses, and if somebody gives a 9 or a 10, says, "I would recommend you," they look at the share of wallet they have at that moment. And if the share of wallet is less than 50%, they call them up and say, "Hey, thank you for the great score, but if you love us so much, your share of wallet should be more than 50%. They have by now created tens of millions in extra sales just through that. And operational efficiencies, for instance, in the contact center environment, we work with Mercedes and many other companies, looking in a holistic way at how the agents act and giving them the freedom to truly deal with the customer from end to end instead of having to do handoffs, increases the time that an individual agent spends with one individual case, but it reduces the time that the company has to spend on a case. So we create efficiencies and we create happier customers, happier agents, and reduced operational cost. So that's step one, creating the value. But once we've created the value, we have to capture the value. We have to show and demonstrate the value to the rest of the organization. And that's where we see a lot of breakdown, because everybody instinctively feels, hey, we're doing something good here, but they cannot prove it. And what we typically advise is, if you have nothing by way of ROI model, start very simple, as easy as it gets. And this little model we have applied, I think, 40 times by now. And typically it takes yourself and 3 colleagues and 15 minutes and a napkin around the table. And just look at, here's the example from the automotive industry, but it works just as well in B2B. It basically works in every industry. Just ask yourself, an unhappy customer, how many purchases does he or she make, and how many does a happy customer do? In this case, automotive, there's the margin on the purchase, there's the margin on the service visits. If we calculate that, we get to a customer value that's already quite differentiated between an unhappy and a happy customer. That makes a lot of sense, I'm sure. The big trick, however, is to look at the next level and saying, so that unhappy customer, how many potential customers does he or she stop from becoming a customer? And that happy one, how many does he or she bring us? And in the case of cars, it's typically you influence 1 car for each car that you yourself buy. And if you look at it like this, suddenly we're having a detractor. If we say he stops 1 average passive customer at the value of 2,500, if we subtract that from the value that he generates himself at 1,200, suddenly we see that the detractor, the unhappy customer, destroys value for the company. While the promoter, where we have a multiplier of 4 cars, 4 times 2.5, suddenly is at 15,000. This kind of differentiation, this kind of difference, 16,300, we see in every industry. And it's a very imprecise calculation. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether the real number is 10 or 20,000. I think everybody instinctively feels that it's a lot and it's worth investigating further. And for instance, in many cases, we can do a very straight up calculation if we do for instance, an NPS, to prove the numbers that we did on the napkin. And this is a real customer where we see that a detractor typically has 60,000 euros turnover per year and a promoter 102,000. That, of course, is the start for a business case. And again, this is the strategic slide. Of course, there's a lot of more in-depth calculations behind it, but this is how you get the attention from senior management. Hey, look, we have 15% detractors. What if we turn all of them into passives? And that's, in this particular case, would already generate 112 million in additional turnover. And from another customer where they calculated the value of one customer saved. And we're talking about tens of thousands of customers, and one customer saved basically repays the whole program. And you can take this now one step further, and this is, for instance, the slide that I would recommend you to start looking into and see how far you get. And the very important thing here is don't make it too complex. Start by looking at what numbers you actually have. And I grade this out a little bit. So this is the outcome that you may come to after a couple of years. But the biggest trick that I want to give you is don't start by trying to create a perfect model. Start by looking at what numbers do I have and how can I link them into a little model that proves enough that allows us to put more time and effort into generating additional data. Because if you make the mistake of saying, okay, here's the 10 data I need, and you go with that to the financial department or the sales department or whoever, they say, whoa, this is too complex, come back in a year. Very important is also to always keep challenging the KPIs. If we want to capture the value, we must look at the KPIs. Very simply put, no behavior in the company is going to change unless the KPIs change, because nobody's going to act against their personal career development or their bonus or anything unless the KPIs are actually changed to allow them to act differently. And also keep in mind that a lot of KPIs, while they originally were put in place with the best of intentions, they often become a negative at some point. For instance, here again from a contact center that we worked with, where we noticed that all the cases closed on day 7 got a very bad customer feedback, very bad NPS. Turned out that at some point somebody had seen that or had decided that 8 days should be the target for case closure, and made that the KPI. And so the agents, or some agents at least, on day 7 simply clicked on the button, case closed. And the customer gets an email, but thinks, but my case isn't closed. And the next day starts a new case, and now he's really upset. So look at your KPIs. And for instance, in Mercedes-Benz, in the customer assistance center, they said, you know what? Nobody knows better than the agents about which KPIs are really getting in the way, which KPIs are destructive towards the customer experience. And by getting them in the beginning, a monthly session on which KPIs to kill, we improved their happiness, we reduced the churn amongst the agents, but we also increased customer happiness, and we created a lot of additional value. And the third step is, once you've captured the value, you've proven it, you need to communicate it into the rest of the organization. Very simple. We need to make sure that all the people within the organization are willing, skilled, and able to participate. And simply put, if you start any kind of CX initiative, there's maybe 10% of the people who really jump on it, who say, hey, I love this, this is great, I want to be a part of this. Only some of them actually have the skills, and even less of them are able to act upon it. So we need to continuously communicate into the organization, look, here's initiatives, actions taken that have generated ROI, that have had these impacts on customers, and are good for you and your career. And then you get, sorry for jumping back, then you get this virtuous cycle going where there's more people taking actions, which has more impact on the ROI, which gives you a better communication, a better story, and can showcase the success towards other departments and senior management to get their support, and again, keep reinforcing this system. And a very, very important part of this is keep telling what you did. Keep telling your customers what you did, but also keep telling your staff what you did. Keep telling the success stories, keep telling what you learned from your customers and how you acted upon it and how that had a positive financial impact on the organization. And looking at the willing, skilled, enable, if you have these people who are really enthusiastic about the topic, turn them into ambassadors, make them successful, put all your attention into making them successful, and then put the spotlights on. Make it a positive story. Very important, focus on the positive stories coming from customers, not the negative ones. So, coming towards our conclusions, look at it from the CCC framework. Put this framework as an overlay on your own organization. Are you getting actionable insights out of your voice of the customer, out of your CEM management, out of your contact center, wherever you get them from your market research? Step 2, are you ensuring that action is taken to actually create the value in many different ways? Are you capturing it? Do you have an ROI model to prove it? And are you communicating the story consistently into the organization to convince more and more people to join the train, so to speak? And use this kind of sheet as a starting point for building your ROI model. And I said it, ROI models should be useful. They don't have to be perfect. It's the biggest mistake we see when people try to build these models. So finally, please, if you have further questions, if you have would like to have a private webinar, for instance, because you think, hey, I should have a couple of colleagues in on this, give me a shout via email, book it directly via Calendly. I'll very happily share more details with you. And if you want to call directly, feel free to call me. Janus.
That's great. Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. You dropped away for a second, but now I hear you.
So thank you. You managed to condense a lot of great details into 23 minutes. We still have time for some question. Those of you who are calling in via the website, you can put a question in the chat, but I think I will also just be quiet for a few seconds to allow somebody to go on mute and then ask the question. So we still have a few moments to ask a question. So here's your chance. Who will go first? Let's see. I could ask one as well. I think you mentioned it early on, this overlooked point that happy customers are easier to service.
Yeah.
Any other often overlooked points, Stefan, that you would like to highlight?
Well, for instance, we get a lot of questions recently from contact centers. So how can we prove our ROI? We're perceived as a cost center and not as a profit center. And of course, that's a complex question where you have to build a more complex ROI model, proving how much the contact center, what percentage of the overall value the contact center drives. But here again, there's a very simple starting point. Most organizations by now agree that a happy customer, whether it's measured in NPS or in any other thing, has a higher value for the organization than an unhappy customer. To stick with the NPS value, once you've agreed that, for instance, what's very much overlooked is that any customer who has an interaction with the customer contact ends on average up much happier with a much higher NPS than someone who has not had a contact. So let me put it differently. We see it in every research we've done. Those who had a contact have a 20% higher, 20 points higher NPS than those that had not have a contact, which goes back to the old saying that it's sometimes better to first, excuse my French, piss off all your customers and make them happy again, because that is actually better than if they dabble along without any incident ever. So for instance, the old adage, the best service is no service, there's actually a question mark there. You have happier and more profitable customers if you have some form of interaction at some point.
Very good. Thank you very much. I was also curious to, I have a lot of questions, I can keep going, but before I jump to the next one, let's see if anybody else wants to jump in with a question or debunk another myth. Perhaps you could say something, Stefan, and that's then my closing question. Can you tell a little bit more about the problem with KPIs?
The problem with KPIs is, on the one hand, they drive behavior. So if you have only financially oriented KPIs, you will never be able to get a customer-focused KPI behavior in there. And the bigger problem, or not the bigger, but for instance, the biggest problem that CX managers typically face is, okay, 5 years ago, we established NPS or CSI or CSAT or whatever the measurement is as a KPI. Everyone in the organization starts focusing entirely on that number. So we, for instance, we love NPS as a way of engaging with customers. We don't love NPS as a KPI. Because I've had it too many times, seen it in organizations that once it becomes a KPI at the group level or even the individual level, people start looking at the how can we change the question? How can we exclude people from being surveyed? How can we make sure that those who have had a bad interaction, or they don't count? We know they're upset. It shouldn't be the KPI driving it. It should be the focus on what is this individual customer telling us and what can we do with that? And for instance, some of the best improvement recommendations typically come from happy customers. And I've just at the beginning of the year did a big audit of a Voice of the Customer program, global, spending millions on it every year. And what happened, because the KPI at 8.5 is set so hard in stone, as soon as the score is 8.5 or higher, nobody looks at the score. And once we started reading through it, we saw big comments and big potential problems for the future looming in the comments that those seemingly happy customers had given. So KPIs get in the way of, let's say, sensible and reasonable interaction with customers.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. And what a great way to finish also with sharing your thinking on the biggest problem that CX managers face. I think we're right on time. So I want to say danke, thank you, gracias, not continue with all of the different translations you have there on the closing slide. Thank you also for those who found the time in a busy December to dial in. Thank you, Stefan, from doing this from what I hope is also a pleasant car. And we will share this recording and the slides afterwards, also with the contact details to Stefan, so that you can continue the conversation. Thank you once again, Stefan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.